515 for having me on. My story in Wales began as I escaped 7 years in London, having come back from Australia, Western Australia. Sometimes in weather like this, I have a storm outside that you can't see. I wonder why I'm actually back. This is a picture of George. This is my sketch of George when I found him in the garden, having buried both his siblings after the storm, very like the one I've got here, broke the nest and destroyed it. And the parents then deserted the nest altogether. Obviously, there wasn't anything left to look after. George saved his own life by screeching as I was about to bisect him with a shovel. I was in the middle of building a dream that I had had for my entire life, actually. And it was the garden. It was the secret garden. The secret garden used to be one of my favorite stories. And I had moved to Mid Wales in 2004 and found George in 2007, by which time the garden was really well on its way. And I was creating circular rooms of flower beds, growing things tall, shipping in rocks, mixing cement and concrete, building walls. And this became my daily obsession. And this book is about, I don't, maybe not the word obsession. Oh, yes, it is. It's obsession. It's also passion. It's also loving doing certain things. It's also loving creatures, loving nature. I had really, I felt, fallen on my feet in many ways. I still feel incredibly lucky to be here. And then there's this little scrap who entered my life at a point where I had 3 little Maltese terriers and a husband, which I don't have the terriers or the husband anymore. The terriers lived long and happy lives. The ex-husband is still living a long and happy life. But Wales, where I wanted to put down roots, wasn't where he wanted to stay. And in fact, I was sort of at the point where I found George trying to keep things moving along because I could sense his unease and I didn't want to look at it. So George became a very welcome distraction. By the time this photo was taken, that's my very scruffy shoe there, George was all of 2 months old. He feathered up so fast and he developed a sort of intellect at such a prodigious rate that I started keeping a diary. In fact, I kept a diary from day one. I keep a diary anyway. And he just entered the diary and took it over. And the book is based on that diary. And the reason it's taken so long to get to publication now is because, unfortunately, after I had written the diary and started turning it into a bit more of a book, then there was, the end of the marriage, and then life got in the way. And so it took me a while to gather my wits and reprise it and bring him, back to life. And well, he might still be. He'd be very old by now. Here he's 2 months old. He is now a nuisance. He's flying. He's the most fabulous nuisance. This is a bird that would sit by my plate and steal food, or steal peas and tuck the peas in my back pocket. This is a bird that, when I tried to hide doggy treats in between a stack of identically folded, identical tea towels by the sink, watched and then popped up on the draining board. And I could swear he was counting. I'm probably imagining it, but he studied that pile of towels, stuck his head in between exactly the right towels, pulled out the bag of doggy treats, which had a slit in it, pulled it out, dropped it on the floor, took this huge flat-shaped doggy treat out, tormented the dogs with it, flew around the kitchen with it, and then dropped it in the toaster because it was a perfect fit. So George related to things that I did. The dogs would pad around, wait to be fed, want to engage, want cuddles. George wanted to be with them, wanting cuddles, wanting attention, especially if I was on the phone. If I was on the phone, he was on my foot, and I strongly suspect I was on the phone when I took this photo. But he related in a way that the dogs couldn't. And that was like a little hook in my heart. I mean, apart from the fact he was also desperately needy and without my attention would die, he became top of the priority list because of that. But he was, and this is George, red mug, red pencils, And George loved that color more than anything else. I used to keep the rubber bands from the mail. The post used to come in, wrapped up in rubber bands, and they were all red, and I'd keep them in a bowl, and they kept vanishing. And I thought my then husband was using them for something, and never bothered to ask the question. And one day I had occasion to climb on top of the bookcase in the kitchen to find something rather disgusting that George had taken up there. And there were all these rubber bands, red rubber bands that George had hidden. And George liked to throw these pencils on the floor, and the dogs would turn them into toothpicks in minutes. As he got older, I realized that I wanted to keep him. This thing that gave me a focus in life beyond any focus the dogs had been able to give me because of his need, and because of this, what I perceived as a really real connection. I didn't want him to go. And the idea that he might fly, which is ultimately, if we love something, we have to be prepared to let it go. And looking after anything from nature, from the wild, and then having to let it go is very good practice. I mean, our friends, our pets, our families, we borrow them, and then we have to let them go. They either die or they move on. And we can't legislate, we can't control that sort of thing, but we can make the most of what we have while we have it. George really did take my tea bag out of the teacup. He was, as I say, he was a tremendous companion, but he was also developing bad habits. He'd do things like take all the knives out of the knife block and drop them on the floor for the dogs to play with. So it's a little macabre. One day I came in and he and the dogs had absolutely decimated the kitchen. Kitchen roll, boxes of tissues, matches, total destruction, at which point I began to think that, that and a habit of hiding dog shit from the dog boxes. The dogs were litter trained, and hiding dog shit from the dog boxes under the sofa cushions, bad. One time I could have probably used him as a tennis ball and a fast serve. Fortunately, I resisted. After 2 months, George could fly, and I knew I was going to have to let him go, and I was dreading it. I mean, seriously worried about this, because he had made a big place in my heart for himself. However, I prepared, I steeled myself, and at 2 months, I opened the kitchen window and sort of pretty much had to toss him out. And off he went, after a bit of a stumble and a bit of a flap. And I was distraught. I was truly upset. And then he came back. And then he went, and then he came back, and then he went. Now, bear in mind that I was creating my dream in the garden. My father, Ted Hughes, had never stayed still when I was a very young child, and I had dreamed of putting down roots. And here I was, putting down roots. In fact, I could say that George was one of my roots, albeit temporary. I did not want to move again. In fact, I haven't moved in years. I'm going to stay here for as long as possible. George started he set up a pattern of coming back every night. And when I was out in the garden, he would be with me most of the time, certainly for the first month of his flying free. But at night, he'd come back, perch on the door of the kitchen and go to sleep. I'd pop him in a cage and there he'd be. George was getting quite a lot older by now. And as you can see, I don't know whether you'd call that love or whether he just thought I was a fence post, but this habit set up a problem. And there I was, absolutely smitten by this bird, and my neighbors weren't. Well, several of them were, that's not fair. Several of them were, several of them loved George, and to my envy, my jealousy, I should never be jealous, wasted emotion. I was a little jealous when I discovered that George had been doing the rounds of the neighbors and making friends in other households, with one notable exception. And unfortunately, that notable exception was an elderly woman, Jean, who lived next door, who I was desperately fond of. And I would not have wanted to worry Jean at all for any reason. And George terrified her. She did not like birds anyway. And George had this habit of landing on people's heads. Normally, he'd pace around the floor at your feet and then bounce off your head and then leave you in peace. If it was me, he'd just come and sit and stay. I think my shoulder got a bit small for him and my head was a better landing post. Jean finally confesses to me one day. The neighbors, one or two of the neighbors had let me know that she was a bit worried. And I realized I was going to have to build an aviary. If he wouldn't fly, I couldn't let him fly free for very much longer, because I couldn't have Jean being made a prisoner in her own house. She'd taken to wearing a hat just to get in the car and lived in fear. As she put it, Frieda, I can't tell your magpie from any other wild ones. And I realized how bad it was. So I set about building the biggest aviary I have, big enough for Eurasian eagle owls. This is Eddie here. George flew off to another life after 5 months, almost to the day. I think he flew like a month and a day after I found him. And I realized I had a gigantic magpie-shaped hole in my life. And people realized I had a big aviary. And I kept telling people I had a big aviary that was empty. And so I found, first it started with an Bengal eagle owl with a broken wing. And I found that there were people who couldn't keep owls any longer. Captive bred owls needed homes sometimes. And I had this big aviary. And because of George, I now have 13 owls. I can't really show you, but at the moment I have a snowy owl sitting on a perch in the corner of the kitchen. I wish I could show you. I'd like to lift this up and take it there, but I fear I may lose you, and I live in Wales and I may lose reception. But Widva has the run of the kitchen and utility. And I have a massive aviary with 6 Eurasians. I have a couple of white-faced Scops owls, a tiny Tengmans owl with the little crooked feet, and 3 barn owls that came from a zoo that could no longer house them. So I have developed, because of George, a passion. I never thought of owls. They came to me, and they came to me because of George. I blame him totally. And I just wanted to share this with you. I had such fun writing this book, and I hope you enjoy reading it just as much. And thank you all very much for watching and listening. Thank you.